to the folks who were able to be here last Tuesday. If you're new, I'm very glad that you're here. Everybody's microphone is muted and I can't control it. However, if you have comments or questions, please put them in the chat box, and we have Dan Libinson will be monitoring that, and we'll pause at strategic moments to see if there are comments or questions that we should be responding to. I am delighted to welcome one of my colleagues at Keshet, Rabbi Micah Buck-Yael, who is Keshet's Director of Education and Training. Keshet is a national organization that works toward full inclusion of LGBTQ Jews in the Jewish world. And I am privileged to serve on the board, and lucky that Micah is one of the many people doing the work. So I get to sit on the board, he gets to do the work. Before he got to Keshet, Micah had the position of Coordinator of Community Chaplaincy with Jewish Family and Children's Service of St. Louis, where he provided personalized support, connection, and meaningful programming for individuals throughout the St. Louis community. His work took him to hospitals, nursing care facilities, private residencies, and many unexpected places. Perhaps he'll tell us about some of those. Micah has a BA in Jewish, Islamic, and Near Eastern Studies from Washington University in St. Louis, an MA in Talmud and Rabbinic Literature and Rabbinic Ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary. Throughout his career, he's advocated and educated for LGBTQ justice, leading trainings and consultations within his local community and the broader Jewish community nationwide. He's the founder of Builders Beit Midrash, a traditional learning community in St. Louis that centers the voices of LGBTQ learners. And he has been a Svara Transformative Talmud Teaching Fellow. In his free time, he is most likely cooking or baking. He is a legendary baker. I mean, to the extent that I get pictures of things that he has baked. And he lives in St. Louis with his wife, Aviva, 4 children, and assorted pets. Micah, welcome.
Thank you. It is phenomenal to be here.
When we were talking about this session, Micah, I asked you what kind of a conversation would you ideally like to have? And you said that a lot of the work that you've done, the advocacy work, involves helping people understand the way LGBTQ people are marginalized and oppressed and have struggle, are not fully included in communities and face struggles in their day-to-day lives. And you said that's, crucial work, but it means when you're doing that work, it's hard to get a chance to talk about the joy and the wholeness and the blessings that have come to you personally and that you've seen come to others from living your identity as a queer person and as a trans person. And I'm hoping that we will get to talk about that today. I wonder if we could start by you explaining some of your life's work, including that advocacy work.
Yeah, I would be glad to. And first of all, I was so happy to hear you begin the conversation with asking that question. Because I am so excited and thrilled and lucky to get to do the work that I do every day as an advocate for LGBTQ equality, and to talk about the ways in which the world continues to need repair as regards to how it treats queer and trans people, LGBTQ people, and any number of other communities or identities that sometimes face marginalization in the world. But what I think is a message that needs to not get lost, even in those moments, but particularly in the rest of the world, is that when we talk about the ways in which the world is sometimes broken in how it treats people, we're not talking about ways in which people are broken, and that we actually need to continue to learn from the strength, creativity, wholeness, fullness, capacity for joy of every person in our communities. And so I was very excited to have the opportunity to be here and to talk about some of those things. And also in particular, something else that we touched on was the opportunity to teach and learn a little bit of Torah together. I have to say, Joy, you are really one of my favorite teachers of Torah in the world. When I hear you speak, when I read anything you've written, it is so clear to me that your ability to pull what is alive to the forefront in Torah is just masterful and beautiful. And I'm really excited to get to have that conversation with you a little bit.
Thank you. I don't think my webcam is good enough to show the blushing that I'm doing. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to getting to study Torah with you also. When you were talking about the importance of remembering the wholeness, even as we're working to heal and understand and hold the ways in which people are broken, it reminds me of the ways the Jewish people in the diaspora, particularly in times of great oppression places, often do a lot of thinking about what the times of the Messiah will be like. The ways that, for example, the rabbis in the Talmud think about what it'll be like when there's a temple again and exactly what we'll do. And I'm wondering if you see thinking about and noticing and elevating images of LGBTQ wholeness as crucial to surviving and also growing out beyond the present day oppression, or am I putting together two things that are really not connected?
I mean, I think you're talking about hope, right? And I think that hope is something that as individuals and as communities, it's difficult to do anything without. And I think that the Jewish tradition, at least the way that I see it, it is like it's training wheels for developing the capacity to be optimistic, right? When we celebrate Shabbat every week, however it is that any of us in our personal lives brings that observance in, Shabbat is framed by the rabbis as a taste of the world to come. And what do we do in order to create a taste of the world to come? We let go of struggle, right? We let go, and this is a teaching that I have from one of my teachers, David Kramer, that what do? We stop the struggle to produce food and shelter and clothing and culture. Right? Those are the sort of four broad categories of the kinds of work we don't do on Shabbat, because we're going to imagine for 25 hours that nothing is lacking, that nothing further needs to be completed. And we know that it's make-believe, and we know that we're not there yet, but we have to get into the practice of being able to envision and imagine, because when we don't envision and imagine, we get lost, we fall into despair, we lose the strength to continue making that world a reality.
That's such a beautiful and rich set of teachings, and I love the idea of training wheels for hope and working toward and imagining the future. And I'm hoping that our conversation will be part of those training wheels, actually. So I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the advocacy work and education that you've done to give us an idea of the kinds of brokenness that you engage, the wounds that you've been working to highlight and help repair. And then maybe we can talk about the wholeness that hasn't gotten into that kind of work.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So in my work with Keshet, I and my colleagues visit various communities, and we teach and we educate. We help people understand what are some of the concepts, what's some of the language that describes the identities and experiences of LGBTQ people, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, and the various other assorted identities and cultures that come as part of that coalition. We usually talk a little bit about what are some of the ways that people who live those identities might have experienced their Jewish communal lives, noting that it's very recent that most of our movements have LGBTQ folks in positions of leadership, be that rabbinic leadership or lay leadership. It's very recent that some of our movements celebrate families who are LGBTQ, same gender parents, have mechanisms for celebrating when adults or children share with the world a new name, a new gender, a new set of pronouns, and helping to balance between the necessity of doing those things and also the awareness that creating communities that are embracing and spaces of belonging for people involves being very clear to state that this is a community that wants your presence. This is a community that wants your leadership. And one of the measuring sticks and one of the tools that we try to give communities is that a community in which LGBTQ people are fully welcomed, embraced, and lifted up is a community in which LGBTQ people are present in a variety of roles, in a variety of leadership positions, and have the ability to disagree with one another as part of exercising that leadership. That's the place that we are striving for. And we help give communities very concrete tools in order to get there.
So as long as everybody of a certain kind in a given community has to pretend to think and want and believe the same things, that would be a sign that they're still marginalized. And a sign of full inclusion is when we get to disagree and be as various and diverse as any other subgroup in the community. Is that right?
I think that is one of the measuring sticks, one of the signposts. People are messy, communities are messy, and everybody gets to be an individual all the time.
So when I was growing up, I am pretty sure that none of the Jewish communities or institutions that I was familiar with would have scored anywhere on Keshet's list of characteristics of inclusive communities for LGBTQ people. I certainly didn't see any signs of LGBTQ people in leadership positions until actually in the 1980s, when I joined Congregation Shar Zahab, and I, for the first time, saw an openly gay rabbi. Of course, I'm so old that I didn't even see women in most leadership positions. But I'm wondering, when you were growing up, what did the communities that you were part of show you about what was possible for you?
That's such a good question. So I grew up in a fairly progressive conservative community, in a community where there were individuals who were present and out and in their wholeness. And I also grew up in a community where some of the adults who I knew who were also anywhere in the spectrum of LGBTQ, there were definitely people for whom those identities meant being closeted and meant living with fear. And so I sort of balanced and saw both of those things. I remember very vividly when I was a teenager, one of those moments that really shook me up was seeing a newspaper story in I think it was in the local Jewish newspaper, about the first transgender person to be admitted to rabbinical school at HUC. That was Reuven Zellman. And I wasn't even 100% sure I knew what that word meant. But I knew that there was something huge that was shifting when seeing that story and that possibility in the world. And I think at the same time, I was experiencing both of those messages from my Jewish communities, and I was also experiencing what there was in the world around us, which was that at the time there was very little in terms of news, writing, fiction, nonfiction, that portrayed transgender people as anything other than suffering, and sometimes in ways that were painful or maybe even that one could describe as sources of terror to a young person growing up, trying to understand, what is this word? What does this concept mean? And it's amazing to me the way in which, like, we're not there yet. The world isn't whole yet, but children and young people who are growing up now are receiving a very different set of images, messages, lessons than either one of us did.
Yes, not all of them, but some
Not all
of
of
them.
them, right? And not exclusive.
As you were talking, though, I realized I worked quite hard to contribute to that literature of queer suffering. I wrote and spoke a lot about the suffering that was bound up for me being a trans person in a world that didn't have a place for trans people. And I felt that that was crucial, partly because it had been a big part of my story, but even before I was living outwardly as a trans person, I felt that it was necessary for me to suffer tremendously in order to have a legitimate claim to being trans. I felt like the message, at first it seemed to me implicit, but when I started talking about transition, it was said to me explicitly, was that if you can live, if I could live as the male that I was assigned at birth to be, if that was viable for me, it was my obligation to do that, because it would disrupt everyone if I didn't. And the only possible justification for not doing that would be unlivable suffering. So for me, the way that I grew up, it was very hard to separate suffering from affirmation of queer identity. And I think that it is fantastic to think that that is shifting, that we've now at a point, not at a point where there's no suffering that goes along with being LGBTQ, but at a point at which we can think about being LGBTQ in ways that don't involve or foreground or highlight suffering, where you don't have to pay the dues of existential anguish in order to be allowed to be who you are.
Yes, that is absolutely the message that has been and still sometimes is, that it's our identities are only quote unquote real if they hurt enough. And that's exactly the message that I think we need to push back against. And being ourselves is enough proof, right? that knowing in our guts who we are, or not knowing who we are, and wanting the freedom to explore and try and be, that's reason enough.
See, that's a terrifying degree of mental health to me. You're a voice from the future that I couldn't imagine for most of my life. I'm realizing that in my generation, being Jewish was also bound up with suffering. This is, or as we engage in Holocaust remembrance, when I grew up, I was taught that the suffering and persecution of the Holocaust was at the very center of Jewish identity. And I've met many Jews who want nothing to do with being Jewish because they feel that there's that they would have to be bound up with this kind of suffering as part of it. So I'm wondering if there's a tikkun, a healing process for Jewish people at large that goes along with shifting the conversation away from LGBTQ pain to LGBTQ wholeness also.
Right. I mean, I'm thinking of when I read the book of Dvarim, the book of Deuteronomy, verse after verse after verse after verse says, God is stating, I won't erase the past and what happened to you. But the reason that you need to remember where you come from is so that when you do act from a place of strength, power, wholeness, liberation, you act with empathy, right? And that, to me, that's a shift from primary identity to we all carry things with us all the time, and we shouldn't try to pretend that being whole means not carrying those things, but that we don't necessarily have to, they don't have to carry us, right? We can carry them.
I like that formulation. I've had, so many decades of therapy, and at a certain point in most of those processes, I've gotten terrified that I'm going to be forced to forget, or deny the suffering that I've been through, that it is an either or choice. And I love that you're saying that even in Deuteronomy, the way the experience of being slaves and the suffering that went along with that is described models a way of healing, but carrying with us what we've gone through and what we've learned from it, with the goal of being better people in the present, not with the goal of building our lives around the past.
Right. I mean, I always feel like I am stepping onto very treacherous ground when I have that conversation, because all of us experience life and joy and pain and trauma and healing so differently. And it sounds too easy to say, this was for the purpose of some greater learning. And that's not what I'm trying or hoping to say, but that to me, Torah and community and nutrition is about living with the full complication of what it means to be human. We talk about that narrative of, we're just coming off the heels of Passover, and we're talking about that narrative of coming out of the place of Mitzrayim, of the deepest constriction. And that's what that word Mitzrayim means, is narrow places. But we're also telling the story of, for me, one of the queerest moments in Tanakh is when we get to the other side of the sea, right? We come out of Egypt and the chariots are chasing us, and we're backed up against the sea, and we have no way forward, and the sea splits and we go through, and then it comes crashing down. And then all the women on the other side bring out their musical instruments, right? They take their timbrels and they sing this song following Miriam. And, you just wonder, why did they pack those? Right. We have as our primary understanding of that moment, they did not have time to pack food, right? That's why there's matzah. It's flat because there wasn't time for the bread to rise. But somehow they had time to pack their musical instruments. And I think, many of the musicians in my life would say that bringing your music with you is actually as important as bringing your food with you. And there's a tremendous power in having the ability to say that. And that's our story too.
That feels like the insight of a parent of small children. When you said that, I'm reminded of the endless hours of preparing to go out anywhere. And did you bring the this, and did you bring the that? And if you forgot the toys, you were in trouble. And the idea of imagining the Exodus as being a similar situation where you better bring what you need for celebration. The idea that they were already whole enough to know that they would need musical instruments on the other side, even if it meant leaving some food or clothing or other things behind. That's really moving. I've never thought of it that way before.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, and why queer, right? Not like, I don't want to lay claim that it is only or exclusively an LGBTQ experience, but to me, that's actually what I find to be definitive of my experience as a queer person and as a trans person, is this capacity for tremendous joy and silliness, and that those things are life sustaining.
So I want you to say more about your idea of the wholeness that goes with queerness. And I'm also wondering, as you said that, if this is or isn't like the role of music and dancing and celebration and humor in other oppressed communities, like the Black American community. Or are you talking, in other words, I guess I want to push at this a little bit. I feel like that's queer in the sense that they would have had to already be somehow stepping beyond their lives as slaves, it, even before they left Egypt, in order to pack those instruments. They would already have had to have a sense of wholeness that didn't fit in that category that the Egyptians had thrust on them for what their identity was. So I have a very broad definition of queer, having to do with any aspect of being human that doesn't fit into the boxes that our cultures give us to define ourselves in. But I am wondering if you feel like there's something more specific about kind of the role of queer joy, and you said silliness. So what's silliness to you, and how does that relate to queerness?
Oh, that's such a great question. I mean, the first half of the question that you asked, right? Why is this capacity to pack the musical instruments before leaving Egypt? It's exactly what you said, that it is, to me, one of the experiences around being queer is having these boxes, these expectations, these narratives of what it means to be a person that turn out to not actually be true of most people. And the ability to say, I actually don't give those boxes authority over my joy, over my life, over my ability to be in myself. And that to me is a queer experience, whether a person experiencing it is LGBTQ or not. Like I would name that as one of the defining experiences of my story, my process. I think silliness, I mean, it's really easy to get drawn into the notion that identity should always be serious all the time, right? And I think it actually follows that narrative that you shared of that a lot of us have been told for a long time, that we only get to take our identities seriously and they only get to be real if not living into them causes great enough suffering. And I think similarly, there's this narrative of if personal narratives aren't serious all the time, then they're not real. And I actually think, no, there's tremendous room for silliness in the world. And that's just as important as the ability to fight for what's important.
For me personally, as a teacher, I consider any class where there's no laughter to be a failure. Not just because I like laughing. Actually, one of my favorite things, I have problems laughing because of growing up the way that I did, trying to hide who I was for all those years. Anything that involves spontaneous expression continues to be hard for me because my life for so long was about rigid editing out of any spontaneous expression. But I love the sound of other people's laughter. But even apart from my own pleasure, it feels essential to me because when people laugh, that is a moment of being relaxed enough to step outside our usual categories and ways of thinking. And one of the first kinds of humor is silly with young children when they do what they're not supposed to do. They make sounds they're not supposed to make. Or I remember what I think of as the moo-ba la 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 phase of humor, where to get my 2-year-old to crack up, all I have to do is say, the cow says ba. And, that is the funniest thing anybody has ever said, because I'm breaking the categories that a 2-year-old is working so hard to learn, but already has this delighted release when you get to step outside it.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you can remember any particularly wonderful moment of silliness that was meaningful to you in your journey toward wholeness.
Particular moment of silliness. That's a much harder question than I expected. There's not a particular moment that comes to mind, but I think it is what you said, right? So much of what does it mean to have humor is to have the capacity for surprise. right? And that there's a certain point at which that comes from breaking our expectations and seeing all these amazing ways in which the world that we inhabit just doesn't fit into rigid expectations ever. And being able to turn that into a source of joy and celebration and happiness, that's what I mean when I talk about silliness and humor as part of my wholeness, and part of my wholeness as a queer person.
So I want to shift to the Torah study we planned in a minute, but what you just said made me wonder something, which is about Purim. Before you were living as yourself, did you experience Purim as a kind of a collective silliness of stepping outside boxes and boundaries? Or did it mean something else? And has the meaning of Purim changed since?
Yeah, I think there's both and, right? There's supposed to be the gaining celebration from the fact that the categories and the boxes and the expectations that we have for the world are limited, right? We're telling the Purim story as this story in which all the humans in it interact in the world as if there's nothing miraculous possible, and God is sort of playing along and doesn't show up in any sort of huge or undeniable way, and the miraculous takes place through this series of utterly absurd coincidences. And I mean, I would say that the genre of that book of Torah is that it is satire. It is a farce. It's meant to make you laugh as you read it, for precisely that reason. And I think a good Purim celebration is one in which that capacity for surprise and for finding blessing in all of those little moments, that's a good celebration of the holiday.
So I'm going to infer that some of your definitions of the kind of LGBTQ wholeness that we'd like us to have in mind as we work toward a better world involves silliness and discovery and embrace of possibility, which means we don't get to be curious and interested in possibilities unless we feel not afraid. When we're afraid, we're wired so that it's too dangerous to embrace a lot of possibilities. A lion is jumping at me. Let me think about the possibilities. What do lions really mean metaphorically? Maybe this is a metaphorical lion. No, we just reduce the possibilities to one and we react accordingly in an attempt to save our lives. So I'm guessing that is another piece of queer wholeness. What have we left out so far that we should also add to this list? Oh, you said celebration also, being ready for celebration under any circumstances.
Right. That's a big piece of it. I think that when I talk about wholeness as a teacher of Torah, and that's a place that I come from, and I know that that's a place where we want this conversation to land, because there's some Torah that we're going to share. But it takes a certain amount of vulnerability to be able to say, I bring my story to my learning and to my teaching in a really whole way. And it requires a lot of safety to be able to risk that kind of vulnerability. But in my learning, the most powerful moments have been, and this is a teaching from my rabbis and teachers at Sfara, that the Torah, this living document that we have to make sense of the world, it actually demands of us that we bring our stories and our vulnerability and our lived experiences to even change the meaning of the text in really bold and important ways. And to not see ourselves as passive subjects of religion or learning or law, but as human participants in that process. And that's something that's been going on for centuries, right? For as long as we have been, or as long as we imagine ourselves studying and engaging with this framework for how to understand the world, it's always been active and participatory, and it's always gone two ways, right? We talk about God and Abraham getting into these arguments, and we talk about Sarah laughing, and she gets taken to task for it a little bit, but there's this sort of sense of disbelief and wonder that becomes part of her narrative. We talk about Moses pushing back and struggling to feel confident and struggling to feel that he has anything to bring to God's process in the world. And that's a Torah teaching for another moment. And then we see these generations of thinkers and scholars who became the rabbis and sort of took control of a tradition that seemed to them like it was falling apart. And they push back again and again and again about what they think it means. And that actually brings me to a piece of text that I wanted to look at today as an example of what does it mean to bring one's voice to the text as a teacher in a way that makes it alive in a different way than might have been seen. So
why don't you cue that up? And I'm just going to ask Dan, are there any comments or questions that we should address before we move into this phase, Dan?
Well, there are two questions that came up in different formats. One question was just a sort of a comment and a question that integration of LGBTQ folks into society, in quotation marks, is important, but how effective will that be if we in the LGBTQ community cannot get along with each other? So, and I'm not sure if the intent there is different of the letters getting along with each other, or something sort of more broad. And then the other question that's here is just a reaction to something earlier in the conversation where they were saying that it reminded them of last week when you, Joy, were talking about the negative use of imagination. What are the negative and positive valences of identity? Maybe it requires moving beyond identity as a category. So those were the questions that are out there.
Thank you. And I would say that latter comment really relates to the idea of queer wholeness and silliness and laughter. All of those would be ways of not having identity, but not being subjugated by it or forcing ourselves into it. Thank you, Dan. Micah, teach us some Torah.
Amazing. So with permission, I'm going to share some text on the screen so folks can see what I am talking about as I share this. And I want to set a little bit of a framework, which is that we are in our weekly cycles of reading Torah, we are telling the story of Leviticus, which is primarily concerned with how do priests, political leaders, and a community as a whole make space for the divine, knowing that what is divine is this raw and immense power. And that's how I make sense of sort of, if I had to put a big overarching narrative over what does that mean. So how does that frame itself? Well, in the worldview of the text of Leviticus, God dwells in a community under certain circumstances and does not dwell in a community under other circumstances. And God dwelling in a community is something that is both good and bad, right? You can't have God's full presence all the time, or you literally burn up. But you don't want distance or tension between the human community and the divine. So in the context of this, we're in this week's portion, we are talking, it's a double portion, Tazria and Metzora, and they are talking about skin conditions that they understand as reflecting some form of contagion. It's not clear that they are describing any particular known illness, although a lot of people have read it as being about how to manage germ theory without knowing what germs are. And I actually take a slightly different read on that. But they are talking about what does a community do when a person has this particular type of visible condition that there's a concern that it could be contagious. And how does one know how to create the right amount of isolation and distance between people? And how does one know how to end those times of isolation and distance, which is far more relevant right now in a whole different way than in the way of telling queer stories. And I'm gonna name that it's actually very hard for me this week to read the verses about what do we do about distance and safety and boundaries and reintegrating together. And those are verses that may never sound the same. But I'm bringing them because I have also heard them in other ways. And because these verses in particular have a long metaphorical history of being used both to explain why certain people or certain situations don't belong in a community, or conversely, why vulnerable populations are sort of metaphorically described as being, who is pictured in these verses. So I will share the first couple, and I'm going to name that they're difficult, but I'm bringing them because I actually think there's a really powerful way in which our tradition flips these verses upside down by the time we're done with them.
And I just want to underline something that you said in that wonderful introduction, which is that from Leviticus's point of view, the problem with these conditions, and they're not just skin conditions. Your house can have these conditions. Your garments can have these conditions. What a nightmare it would be to have your house declared to have, this condition of impurity and have to be torn apart brick by brick and everything like that. But the Leviticus is completely unconcerned with the human effects of this. This is all about making it safe for your community to have God inside it, as Micah was saying. And God is portrayed as, it's kind of like having a nuclear reactor in your community. There are ways to have a nuclear reactor in your community that are really unsafe. And there are ways that increase the degree of safety of it. It's never completely safe, but there are definitely things you don't want to do as a community. And so these laws are not, unlike the laws about social distancing and stuff, which are about how humans are dangerous to one another. This is actually about what human beings have to do to make the human space safe for God to be in, as opposed to what we have to do to be safe for one another.
Thank you for that. It's always important to remember that when we jump metaphorically from one way of reading the text to another, we're making a jump. But I'm going to share two snippets from that portion, and then what I think is actually the most exciting piece. So has this shown up for folks?
Yes.
Beautiful. So there's a little title page, just because I think that's helpful. But when I'm looking at these verses, I read, the person with a affliction. Many of the translations use the word leprosy or leprous. It does not seem medically that that's actually what's being described, but metaphorically, there's a long history of using that word. So I'm going to allow it to stand in the translation for now. His clothes shall be torn, his head shall be left bare, and he shall cover his upper lip, and he shall call out, impure, impure. He shall be impure as long as the affliction is on him. Being impure, he shall dwell apart. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. So this is the two verses that seem to reflect in any way the actual experience of a person experiencing one of these conditions. There are all sorts of lengthy descriptions of what someone's skin might look like, and the priest should check this and then check again in 7 days. And is it growing? Is it shrinking? Is it healing? Is it not healing? And these two verses are the only ones that name the individual's experience. And And this does not sound in any way like a pleasant or affirming experience, right? It's very clear in these verses that the individual's experience is being sort of, I don't know, subjugated to the community's experience or left irrelevant to the community's experience. And then and you had a...
Well, I was going to say that these laws seem to be designed to ensure that somebody who's diagnosed with one of these conditions would feel the way I always felt in junior high school, going into school with a new pimple on my face. I felt like was walking around shouting impure, impure, and that I was marginalized and that people would stay away from me. That was an internal condition of shame. My body has externally shamed me, but this is like, in case people can't see that you have this, you have to rip your clothes, you have to do all of these things that destroy your normal social status so that people will know to stay away from you. And as you put it, that means the needs of the community have completely trumped any needs of the individual.
Yes. And it's also noteworthy, and I think that we talked about this a little bit the other day, the next thing that happens, and obviously I've skipped quite a number of verses, the next thing that happens is that a person comes back in. And so we're beginning this next chapter, part of the same reading. God spoke to Moses saying, "This shall be the ritual for the Mitzorah at the time that he," and the Torah uses the language of he here, the time that he is to be cleansed. "When it has been reported to the priest shall go outside the camp. If the priest sees that the Mitzorah has been healed of this scaly affliction, the priest shall order 2 live, clean birds, cedar wood, crimson stuff, and hyssop to be brought for him who is to be cleansed." And there's this huge ritual of cleansing and bringing back in a person who has had one of these experiences. And there are two reads of this that I have heard that I think are worth naming. And the first is that, I've heard verses like these, portions like these, used very much as a weapon against communities or individuals who some figure of authority had decided that they didn't want there. And it's important to name that whether or not Leviticus understands that to be the intent of these verses, and I would argue that Leviticus does not consider those at all to be the intent of these verses, communities have used them on more than one occasion to do that. I've also heard these two pieces used in ways to make what I call the inclusion argument. And when I say inclusion, I'm not actually meaning it as the ideal. I've heard people make the argument, and I've heard some of my rabbis and teachers make the argument that, look, the priest has to go outside the camp. The priest has to be in relationship with the person who it's been decided the community didn't want. And if the priest can't be in that relationship, then the whole system is broken. And I think, it's obvious the ways in which that can be a helpful argument, and it's obvious the ways in which that is actually a vastly incomplete argument, right? That it's the same as the read that says, we, whoever the we is that owns this space, would like to include those others over there because we think they need our help, affection, support to be included in our space that's going to remain ours.
That's right. And I think that metaphoric slippage that you were talking about is underlying both of those readings, because this has nothing to do with queer people. Queer people might have what's being called a scaly affliction. The very thoughts horrifies me. Or they might not have it. In fact, this is a condition that might affect everybody and anybody. And it is specifically not about what's inside you. It's not about how you feel. It's not a moral judgment. It's not even about how you act. Those are later layerings on that tradition said, well, if you get one of these things, that must be because you're being punished for doing something like this. That is not the way the Torah portrays this at all. This is just stuff that happens to human bodies. God apparently is not going to behave if those bodies are in a camp where God is dwelling. So we've got to make sure that those bodies are marked as being not able to be within the community. And then when we bring them in, we have to make sure that they've undergone a process that makes it safe to have them as part of the community. But it's not about who people are or even what people do.
Right. This is not a text about identity. It's not an LGBTQ text. It is a ritual text that has been weaponized intentionally against many groups at many points in time. And the reason, aside from it being this weekly portion, but actually the reason that I wanted to share something that has been done with it before any of that use, well, I don't know if it was before, but at some point in the history of Jewish thought, someone understood that there was a danger of that and did the following thing with the text. And I'm going to take us to another piece. But every time we read a Torah portion, we read what's called a haftarah, a selection that comes from one of the books of the prophets that is understood in some way to complement or add to or help explain the meaning of the Torah text that we read that week. We don't know exactly when this happened, but we know it was early in the history of rabbinic and Jewish thought. And so they take this, and I think that it is a very deliberate form of commentary, right? Sometimes it's very clear what the relationship is between this second text that we read and the first, and sometimes it's not. To me, the fact that at some point the ancestors of Jewish thought decided that we would never get to read those verses that people weaponize without reading these verses too. And the first snippet that I have actually comes from before that haftarah starts, but it's, I think, an important piece of explanation. There's a war going on in the Book of Kings between the northern kingdom of Israel, Samaria, and Aram. And the prophet Elisha, who's one of those miracle workers of the north. It's sort of a whole category of prophets that exist in Jewish literature. And he makes a prophecy that in the middle of this siege and in this famine, by tomorrow, a seah, a measurement of flour, shall sell for a shekel at the gate of Samaria. In other words, it will be very inexpensive. And 2 seahs of barley for a shekel. The aide on whose arm the king was leaning spoke up and said to the man of God, even if the Lord were to make windows in the sky, could this come to pass? And he retorts, you shall see it with your own eyes and you shall not eat it. So there's this rejection of hope on the part of the leadership or on the part of at least this person whose words are considered important enough to quote. There's this rejection of hope. It's not possible. Not even God could do that. And then that's the point at which we pick up the narrative. And we read, there were 4 men, Mitzoraim, people with this condition outside the gate. And they said to one another, why should we sit here waiting for death? If we decide to go into the town with the famine in the town, we shall die there. And if we just sit here, we shall die here. Come, let us desert to the Aramean camp. If they let us live, we shall live. And if they put us to death, we shall die. And they set out at twilight for the Aramean camp. But when they came to the edge of the Aramean camp, there was no one there. And there's this very raw moment there of what does it mean? Like, what is the lived experience of, put the cloth over the upper lip and have to say unclean, unclean and be rejected? That there's this initial reaction of, well, bleep them, right? They're not behaving in the way that one should. We have nothing left to invest in that community. Let's desert to the other side. Maybe things will be better there, whatever the other side is. But it's a very human response. And it is not only present, but it is explained fully and not critiqued by this text. And they go and they find the camp. There's been this miracle made.
I just want to bring out what you're saying, just make sure that it's underlined because it's important. This is a moment where the people who are marginalized and excluded from the Israelite community, the subjectivity that was not in Leviticus, the way it would feel to be in this situation, suddenly the Torah is making the marginalized people's feelings and experience the center. We are
Right.
literally seeing the story from their perspective. They become the actors in the story. The rest of the community is just stuck behind the gates. And the people who are usually left in a historical void, there are presumably always people in every Torah community in the Torah, there are people hanging outside who are not pure. We never hear about any of them. But for this moment, they're the only people from the community that we hear about.
Right, right. So we never read that text from Leviticus without reading it from these four people's point of view.
Mm.
And then they desert, they go to the camp that's besieging the town, the Aramean camp, and there's this miracle that has happened where all the soldiers have been chased away and the camp has been left full of food and supplies and clothing and everything that they own. And this is a sort of a miracle that's happened and only been brought about and only been discovered because these four people decide to go directly to that camp. And they get there and they do what one does, right? They eat, they drink, they start to carry off silver and gold and clothing and buried it. They came back and went into another camp, another tent, and they carried off what was there and buried it. And they said to one another, "We're not doing right. This is a day of good news, and we're keeping silent. If we wait until the light of morning, we shall incur guilt. Come, let us go and inform the king's palace." So they go back to the city and they explain to everyone, we're actually not all going to starve to death. There's food here, right? The siege is over, the camp is empty, and there's food. And there's a little bit of back and forth before they're believed, but ultimately what happens is that they actually, the army has been chased off permanently, and they bring this food into the city, and there's a reprieve from the situation that everybody is in. And what I think is really important, when I read this story, I don't read it as a critique of their first impulse of let's survive, right? That is everybody's most important impulse. But I read it as actually these four people are, not only are they the only point of view that we learn in this story, but that without their existence, without their goodwill, without their courage to show back up and save the community that they come from, everybody goes down. Right? That if the most marginalized in this community are marginalized, the community itself can't survive. And I know that I'm making several metaphoric jumps there, but to me, I found this to be a text that has been a source of immense joy as I look at a tradition that has verses that are used in ways that inflict pain on others, to actually say the very first layer of understanding of those verses was a group of people who said, those verses over there are very risky. We need to bring these verses here to be right by their side because we need to show our community. And this is how they teach, right? They don't say A and therefore such and such. They say, well, look at this story, but look at this other story. And the human story rewrites how we see what's there in Leviticus. And it rewrites how we see the dynamics of power and who is the hero of the story and who is on the margins, and whose story this is to tell. And I don't have to be doing it for the first time, right? I can go back into the depths of Jewish thought. Somebody else was doing that too.
The rabbi set the table for you.
Right.
But what the rabbis couldn't have anticipated is that you would frame this under the heading of queer joy. And reading it through that lens, I'm noticing that we see them make a discovery, right? They get their suffering is highlighted. They're not only lepers, they're lepers who are starving to death. Then they experience this miracle. They get to eat and drink. They who had nothing, they have everything. And then we see that they take this moment of wholeness just in themselves as individuals, and they say, no, Our understanding of ourselves is that we are still part of and obligated to the community that excluded us. We're not going to wait for a priest to come out to us and put us through a ritual of purification and make us safe for the community. If we do that, we'll be doing the wrong thing. What we need to do is, we don't need the community to make us full Jews or full human beings. We've got everything that we need in ourselves, and based on what we know about what it means to be a full, whole human being and part of this community, we've got to go back whether or not we're welcome and make sure that everybody gets to share in this abundance with us. People often wonder why queer Jews and other, African-American Jews are often alienated from white Jewish communities. Why do we keep coming back? And I think this story gives a good image of it. It's because this is our community, and because we have riches that we want to share with our community. We don't want to cut ourselves off and define a new separate community. We want to be able to bring our wholeness back into the community that we know is ours.
Right, that nobody's categorization or ability to put people in boxes or a desire to control and only see what they expect in others, that none of that can ultimately work, right? None of that can take away our wholeness, our joy, our riches. And as far as the question of obligation, I think there's true complexity there, and I want to put sort of maybe a post-it note on that. But that what's highlighted is that these are the only people whose story is told and changes history and changes the community that they live in. And very specifically, their story is contrasted, and I'm going to stop sharing this screen now. And their story is contrasted with the folks who have lost the ability to hope, right? That this person who says, even if God could make a window in the sky, things would never get better. But these are the people who take into their hands, actually, we know how and where it can get better from.
Thank you so much, Micah. I don't want to stop and I also wanted to thank you for so diplomatically pointing out that I'd oversimplified in what I said about the obligation part. Hopefully the post-it note, hopefully we'll have a chance to come back and unpack that post-it note in another conversation. But I know that our time is running short, and I wanted to thank you so much. This has been wonderful. And I want to invite everybody to next week's, we will be doing something a little different. It's the last week of National Poetry Week. And as an American poet, that's part of my identity also. So I'm going to be reading poems from a project that I've been working on for a couple of years, in which I've been trying to write poems through which the Shekhinah, what Jewish mystical tradition imagines as the female aspect of the divine. And in Jewish tradition, that aspect doesn't really get to talk. But in these poems, she does all the talking. And the people that she's talking to are us. So for the first time ever, I'm going to read the first section of that book, and I hope that people will join me for that. I'm really excited and a little scared. So, Micah, thank you again so much. It has been a privilege and a pleasure.
Thank you. It is always phenomenal to get to learn with you.